In this video, we're going to explore survey methods. Often, surveys considered a key approach in large quantitative research. However, we're going to think about it from perspective of being a useful tool in either qualitative or a mixed method inquiry. We're going to examine some core principles of survey design. We're going to think about when we use this method and the various ways that it can be deployed to collect valuable data. At its most fundamental level, a survey is a systematic method of data collection used to understand a large population. So we gather data from a subset of that whole population, and we assume that that data is going to be representative in one way or another of the entire population. So several features define the survey method. The most important is its use of standardized questions, which ensure that each participant responds to exactly the same stimulus. This is crucial for comparing data across the sample. Surveys are versatile and can include both open and closed-ended questions. So we can use things like multiple choice or rating scales, but also have boxes where people can fill in more sort of narrative responses. Typical surveys are self-administrated, meaning that the participant completes them by themselves. However, it's also possible in some situations that the researcher might work with the participant to complete a survey. The ultimate goal is to describe trends or attitudes or characteristics of the population. So surveys are extremely useful when we wish to gather information from a large group of people in a relatively efficient way. It's ideal for measuring the prevalence of certain attitudes or behaviours, for describing characteristics of a large population, or comparing different subgroups within a population. The bottom of the slide has a list of typical research questions that might be explored through the use of a survey. As you'll see, they allow the study of broad patterns. For this reason, they're frequently used as part of mixed methods or quantitative research, but might also play a role in qualitative approaches. So this slide outlines 9 key stages in planning for a survey. You might want to pause and just have a quick look through them. As with all forms of method, their use should really naturally flow from a well-defined research question. And if you define your question well, some of the issues here will kind of write themselves. Point 8 is particularly important when we're designing surveys. It's easy to miss wider contextual information that those answering your questionnaire might not be aware of or understand. So for that reason, trialing with somebody outside of a research process is an important element before kind of administering your survey more widely. Something which is missing from this list is to do with promotion. And I think that's really important. The best designed survey is kind of useless if you're only going to get, let's say, 3 responses. So planning how you're going to disseminate and get people to actually respond to your survey is critical. So having designed your survey, as I said, you need to shift to thinking about implementation. You might want to post it out. Let's say you're using social media, you might want to send it out once, but that's unlikely to be enough. So you want to have follow-up responses which are polite, which help people sort of remind people they need to submit. Sometimes people use incentives. So it might be that you have a giveaway draw, perhaps you have a bottle of bubbly, or you have a small amount of money or something. And that might be one way of encouraging people to complete the survey. However, that is also problematic in other ways. Sometimes it might lead people who are less representative or less suitable as participants to complete the survey, simply so that they position themselves with a chance to win the prize. There are also a number of ethical considerations that you need to take into account when you're planning your surveys. So an obvious one is that many people are now falling back to using tools like SurveyMonkey, and that's really efficient. And it can be a great way of leading and planning a survey and administering it. But because you are disseminating things electronically, receiving information electronically, and then storing data electronically, it suddenly pings a whole load of GDPR things. So there are legal requirements about how you administer and you store your survey data. So if you're thinking of conducting a survey that way, a really critical way of thinking about this is thinking about the legal aspects of how you're going to administer it and what you need to do and how you need to store that data. As with all of these different methods, there are different kind of subgenres of surveys. One way to do this is to do a cross-sectional survey. So here you choose one point in time to survey your population. A slight variant of that is that you actually do multiple surveys with different populations around the same time. So let's say that you've developed a project or a curriculum which you're leading in schools, and perhaps you've managed to find 3 teachers who will lead this project with their Year 9 classes. What you could do is at the end of the project have a snapshot kind of survey with those 3 different teachers, those 3 different classes, and get data from them. So that would allow you to compare the 3 different groups. The other key way that you can administer a survey is longitudinally. Sometimes you might choose to do that at 2 points, let's say at the beginning of a project and at the end of a project or an intervention. However, it's also possible to administer a project longitudinally where you have multiple check-in points. So perhaps over a 2-month period, every 2 or 3 weeks, you administer a new survey, and this allows you to track changes over time and developments. So both of these are different ways that you can actually administer a survey. As we've discussed, there are different ways to administer it. Online surveys are particularly popular now, not least because some of the tools that they allow you to have analyze that data for you without you having to be too involved. So that can be really, really useful. But whilst online might seem like the easiest way, I might caution against it because it's also the least personal. So it's the most open to having people who potentially sit outside of your survey sample. So the people who you want maybe don't answer it, people who you don't want to have answer it do. So I might think about things like paper surveys. They can be really useful to administer, particularly if you're looking at a project or something like that. If you go to the session and you actually hand pieces of paper to people, you're far more likely to get a decent response. Those people are very likely to sit with a pencil straight after a session and to tick your survey for you and fill it in. So traditional ways are quite powerful still. On the list, we've got telephone. Very unlikely you'll use it, but just be aware that's one way that you could do it. Face-to-face, this is where you complete it for somebody. Just think of that kind of third way. It's possible for you to use something like Zoom and to deliver the response or to deliver the survey with you asking questions, almost like an interview. However, a difference would be that with a survey, you're a lot more likely to have questions with yes, no answers or scales like Likert scales, what are called Likert scales. So out of 5, how would you rate this experience kind of questions? Whereas you're unlikely to have those if you were doing an interview. There are a number of different pitfalls that you've got to be aware of. You need to make sure your questions only ask one question per question. So avoid having 2 parts to a question or complex questions. There are real challenges in terms of people simply ticking boxes without really thinking about it, either giving everything sort of 4 out of 5, that type of response. If you make your survey too long or too complex, the quality of the answers is likely to drop off. I remember buying a Christmas tree one year and I got an email shortly afterwards because I did it mail order, and it said, will you complete our questionnaire? So I looked at page 1 and I answered the questions and it said next, and I assumed when I hit next that I would have a thank you message, instead of which I went to page 2 and then page 3, page 4, page 5, page 6. And I'd literally bought like a £20 Christmas tree or something. So by the time I got to page 6, I wasn't really answering the questions and the survey itself was essentially pointless. So think about things like that and how you build your survey to make sure that you get the information, but only the information you need, without placing too much responsibility and onus on people to go through a long process. There are a number of strengths to leading with surveys. It's why it's used so much in quantitative data collection. It's cheap to administer. You can potentially reach a huge number of people. I mean, nothing stops you potentially reaching thousands of people, and so you have a huge data pool. It's standardized, which is great, which means that you're able to compare against groups or across time, all of these types of things. It's quantifiable, which is useful for statistical analysis. And as we've discussed in previous videos, very often it can be used really well with mixed methods, either placed before or after qualitative data collection, as a way of either kind of finding out what a large pool of people think about something, or gaining quantitative data on something that you've qualitatively explored and found out about. There are a number of limitations. I guess the key thing here is a lack of depth. You're not able to go back and to ask follow-up questions. Sometimes you can. One way of doing this is to do a survey where people actually put their details on it, and then you can select a few of those people's papers, those survey papers, and then follow up with qualitative interviews or something similar. But on the whole, typically a survey you don't follow up on. So there's no follow-up questions. Sometimes that information is thin, it's not rich, it's not good for qualitative data, but it can be really good in terms of that quantitative thing. Some other issues, it's really important that you test your survey before you administer it. If you administer it, you send it out, and you start getting back responses, and all of a sudden you realize that it would be so much better if you just asked this one additional question. It's a bit late. Methodologically, it's problematic to add a question later, and it's just too late. You've sent it out, it's done, so you can't really change it afterwards. So that testing is really important. The key issue that I found though with students who have done survey is getting responses, and it's the big issue. Students quite often think, oh, well, I'm asking teachers who are piano teachers. I know thousands of those. There are so many of those everywhere, let's say. And then when they send out their survey, they get 3 responses. It's very typical of that kind of thing happens. And then they're lost. They're really struggling for the next 2-3 months to try to pick up the odd 1 or 2 bits of feedback, and that can be problematic. So it's important that we place it as a backup for qualitative. It can be really good, and even if you only get 4 or 5 responses, that can still be useful and we can use it. However, if you're really pitching as doing quantitative research and you only get 3 responses, there's no way that you could claim any kind of generalizability from that. So at that point, we have a major issue. This is bibliography. As with all of these videos, I've really just scratched the surface. So you're going to want to go away. You're going to want to do some reading if you're thinking of doing a survey. Look into them more deeply. They're really good in some ways. They're good to use with qualitative research. They're good on their own as a form of quantitative research. In some books, you'll even see survey described not as a method, but as a methodology in and of its own right. So anyway, I hope it's been useful. Go away, have a look at some of the core texts if you're thinking of doing it, and I shall see you in the next video.